morning, everybody. My name is Abby Vance, and I'm from Grenada, Mississippi. I'm a fifth-year senior graduating in May in journalism with a minor in English and a magazine specialty, thanks to Mr. Magazine himself, Dr. Husney. And it is my pleasure and honor to introduce to you today Mr. Daniel Dejan, who is the print creative manager for North America and Sappi Paper.
Good morning. Oh, very soft. Oh, so soft. Sounded like you were apologizing for morning. Hi. Last year, I did a presentation and a body of work on research on haptics, the neuroscience of touch. And we were so fascinated by this research that we wanted to continue it and continue the conversation. I think while many of the speakers that you're going to be seeing today are working very much on a macro level, they really want to give you some insights from a 30,000 foot and then maybe 20,010. This is a very different presentation, and this is really about the core of how we do what we do, and to talk about what's happening in our industry overall. While it is magazine concentration, I certainly am as concerned about book, direct mail, all the different forms that we use for marketing communication. And this started very much with a conversation and a research paper done by Millward Brown in 2009. And they asked a very, very basic question, but it was so simple. It was so very core focused. And they asked, in fact, a question that when asked sort of exponentially opened up conversation. And they asked the question, is content just content? I mean, if we go back 20 odd years, the idea that we write an article or we write an opinion and then we publish it in a magazine and then or a newspaper, and we felt very much that, well, we'll replicate it online. And the question became, in fact, does that really do the job? Does that, in fact, translate? More importantly, it begged a larger question if we go back to what Marshall McLuhan said. And he admitted in his career that in many cases he was wrong, not because he was not correct at the time. He was very much correct at the time, but the evolution of technology exploded so quickly, it impacted how we do what we do. By the way, I did that one, but I wanted to pay homage to Bo Sachs because I looked at it and I went, oh, that's for Bo. So when we were doing this deep dive research, on a program called Print And. Most of you may or may not know, I'm very privileged. While I work for a paper mill, and we make our primary focus is in the manufacture of paper, I also work for a company that takes a very, very large portion of its profits and reallocates it into research, and we do very deep dive research. This, as an example, we really wanted to understand the impact after a 10-year span when we did Life with Print of how technology was impacting all of the different marketing communication and et cetera. And this was an 18-month, multi-million-dollar research project, was very, very well received by the market and awarded. But what we wanted to do was to look at what was happening in terms of the way the technology was impacting the user. And we came upon this white paper from Millward Brown, and the white paper itself was extraordinary. They started with, it was Millward Brown who started with the concept of content, just content. And they brought in a large host of volunteers, a control of volunteers, and once they had them read ink on paper, content ink on paper. They had them read the same content, slightly modified, on a tablet, and then again, they had it read to them to simulate passive communication. And they, most importantly, this is the first time they decided they wanted to bring in neuroscientists. They wanted to see what was happening, not just neuroscientifically, but also psychologically and physiologically. What was going on? And they brought them in. They did the experiments. They did the scans. They took the 2 scans, ink on paper, content on a digital device. They overlapped them. And one of the things that they started seeing was this extraordinary activity in the brain. And this is something that, please understand, we have been intuiting for a long time. But for the first time we started getting scientific validation, what we were seeing was that, in fact, while we were reading ink on paper, we were actually seeing very, very different activities and not expected at all. So what was going on was that what we came to realize is when we read, and this is just a recap, I did this last year and I just want to reset the mood. When we read ink on paper, or let me do it in the other way, when we read on a device, once you are used to the weight, the temperature, the feel of the device, it honestly becomes a monolith. It adds nothing whatsoever to the reading experience. And it's exacerbated by the fact that it's glass. You do this, if you're not looking, you have no idea what's there. All right? Why is that important? Because there was a very important experiment done in England where they wanted to understand why very, very high testing students were doing so well. So they brought in as many students as they could that had excellent grades. And they asked a very simple question: how do you do what you do? You know, you do so well on exams. And 97% of the students said exactly the same thing. They said, I see the question, I understand what you're asking, and then I see the book, I see the chapter, I see the page, I see the formula, or I see the paragraph. I can see it, and so I extrapolate from that, and I answer it. What was important was that they realized this is a physiological and a neuroscientific process known as mapping. You know how we all talk about pigeonholes, where we take information and we store it in certain places? That's exactly what it is. The ability to take information and find the right place to put it so that we can capture it. And one of the things that has happened over time is that we realize we can map if, in fact, the content is tangible. It is extraordinarily difficult to map in a moving object. Digital information is a stream. It just keeps moving. You have to find a way, and we all do find our own way, to be able to stop it momentarily, to be able to capture it and appreciate it. But it takes time. And we also talk about a big difference between business to business and business to consumer. Business to business, we're far more apt to be able to read on a monitor because we have to do it for business emails, etc. But when we read ink on paper, we're stimulating 4 senses. When we read on a digital device, we're really only stimulating 2, largely visual. Auditory if it's got a video or whatever. When we read ink on paper, we stimulate 4 senses. Obviously the sense of sight, very much the sense of touch, and that was what the book was all about. You know, with 2,000 neuroreceptors in your fingertips, you are taking in an astronomical of information in terms of the feel of the paper, the weight of the paper, the surface. You know, we love now using things like soft touch or grit because it changes our feel and the way that we relate. And I'll take that a step further in a second. Interestingly, it is also the smell of ink and paper, the olfactory. Let me do this, and if you don't mind, just if I were to ask you to clear your mind a second and recreate the smell of a library or a bookstore, you do it like that, don't you? Interestingly enough, one of the greatest bibliophiles, and unfortunately we just lost him, happens to be one of the greatest designers, is Karl Lagerfeld. And 5 years ago, he created a perfume called Paper Passion. Now, of course, I had to buy it, okay? But he said something, and the reason I wanted this, because he's extremely esteemed as a designer and incredibly knowledgeable, and I wanted to read his manifesto. Why did he create this? And one of the things that he said was, you know, very much on a neuroscientific level, we are recording machines. From the time we are born, we are recording senses, the feel of the blanket, the feel of our mother, etc. And one of the things that he said is, the smell of ink and paper has been with us since we were reading the funnies Sunday morning. But the fact is that the smell of ink and paper has in fact become an absolute. It is as important to us as amber, sandalwood, rose, anything else. And in fact, perfumers now use paper absolute as one of the ingredients and elements that we use to make perfumes. And lastly, interestingly, the sound of paper. The point of it is this. What they proved in the Millward Brown research is, and the conclusion was, interestingly enough, the more senses that we in fact stimulate, the more of an emotional relationship we create with the content. More importantly, we remember it longer. We have a longer mnemonic retention of it. And I'm going to take this far deeper on the new research that we've done that I think will help us to better understand what happens. That idea that it is a physical object and that it is very real changes our relationship to it as opposed to something that is so much more ethereal as what we see on a digital device. Does that make sense? Okay. By the way, I'm going to ask you, does that make sense a lot? It's the way that I operate because I'm going to start talking really fast. At some point, I'll be talking like a ferret on espresso, okay? And I'll turn to you and I'll go, does that make sense? And it just requires a very polite sort of, and I'll move on, okay? But if I don't get the and you give me the RCA dog look, I'll stop and I'll... So we wanted to understand this, and that research that Millward Brown did, this is what was so important, because, and I cite this for a reason. The research that Millward Brown did became an article in Scientific American called Why the Brain Prefers Paper. Please understand that this started on an academic level, an extraordinary amount of research on a global basis, enormous amount of research happening in the Scandinavian countries, in England, here in the United States, some in Canada, because we were trying to track the impact that technology was making on us in the way that we assimilated literature, marketing, communication, pleasure, business. And I love this where it says, people understand and remember what they read on paper better than what they read on screen, and researchers think it's the physicality. And in this case, they said the physicality of paper. I would share with you it's the fact that we are able to stimulate all four senses. What we proved in our research, which was so incredibly important to us, was later proven again and again. We wanted to take this. We did this book called The Neuroscience of Touch. We hired singularly one of the finest neuroscientists in North America. It was a gentleman named Dr. David Eagleman. We hired Dr. Eagleman. We hired his lab to do experiments for us. If you're not familiar, superb CV. He was the chair of both the Department of Psychology and the Department of Neuroscience at Baylor for several years. He's now at Stanford. He has done some of the most world-class neuroscientific research at his lab, and he's continuing to do so. He wrote a book that was on the bestsellers list for 18 months, and more importantly, he did a 6-hour, 3-part series on the brain for PBS. And that sort of launched him as the golden boy of neuroscience, particularly in the Discovery and the Science networks on television. And oh, by the way, it also made him unaffordable to us again. We're like, damn, oh, we were so close, you know? But he's brilliant. And quick sidebar, I cannot invite you more warmly to see his TED Talks. They are some of the highest viewed TED Talks. A couple of them about the neuroscience of communications. Also, he created, I don't have the time to talk about it, he created a vest for the deaf to help them hear that is groundbreaking. It's been called as important to the deaf as Braille is to the blind. So we hired Dr. Eagleman and asked him to do some experiments for us, which we paid for. We also wanted him to continue. He was fascinated by the research. The whole topic of how does the physicality of paper versus tablet change the way we assimilate information. And one of the things that he said, and he's got a brilliant book and we don't have the time, he said, you know, first of all, what you have to appreciate is half of the brain is in fact dedicated to the senses. And of that, half of that is in fact dedicated to touch. Touch becomes so incredibly important. And he kept really repeating himself on the fact that we take our senses for granted because we've always had them. He said it's not until you have one taken away that suddenly you realize its importance. You know, and we've all had conditions where, you know, for some reason your ears are blocked and you can't hear, or you go to the dentist and he numbs you out and you're like doing this all afternoon. So he talks about something that is key. And I think that we need to talk about it at this level. And it is, he talks about the endowment effect. And the endowment effect, what Eagleman shares with us is after the most primal needs, shelter, food, you know, warmth, etc., the most base emotion is desire. And he proves this. And he says, quite honestly, that it is a psychological phenomenon known as the endowment effect. In its most primitive form, it is you see something, you want it, and you decide, you do a risk evaluation. What's it going to take me to get this? Okay, so perfect example, Samir has something, I see it, you know, I want it, I do a risk evaluation. Do I think I can take it from him? I think, no, he's in pretty good shape. He'd probably kick my ass. No, risk evaluation, I'm not going to do it. Take that and think about the evolution of our intellectuality. It doesn't have to be a physical object anymore. It can be something that can be intellectualized. It can, if I say to you gold, pearls, property, suddenly you stop and you have to look at, I really want this, it's really important. You do a risk evaluation. Am I prepared to go to war for this? Am I prepared to lose friends and family for this? And this has been the history of man. Take it to the next level. It is, in fact, at its very core, the endowment effect that works in all advertising, marketing, and merchandising. I was an art director for all of my 30s and early 40s. I can create an absolutely breathtakingly beautiful image. I work in association, collaboration with my photographers and, you know, with my design team. If I create an extraordinary ad and you see it and you think, wow, that's beautiful, I really want this, you immediately start to scheme. It is the endowment effect that has, in fact, been tweaked.
In 2003, the Attorney General's office in Illinois put out a warning to holiday shoppers. They said, don't let companies put something in your hand while you're shopping around because this might lead to unwanted purchases. So what was that about, and why did the Attorney General's office get involved? Well, let's start at the beginning. There's a psychological phenomenon known as the Endowment Effect. And it means that if I own something, I think it's more valuable than if you own it. So let's say I were to win this coffee mug in a raffle. So I might sell it to you for, let's say, $10 because that's what I really think it's worth. But if you own it, I'm not going to pay more than $6 for it because it's just a coffee mug. So the idea is that things are more valuable if they already belong to us. And this happens to be true across cultures and even across animal species. Even monkeys behave this way. So what does this have to do with touch? Well, it turns out that the endowment effect is so powerful that you don't have to actually own something in order to feel that possessiveness. Just the mere suggestion of ownership is sufficient. Later research found that just imagining owning an object, or even just imagining touching it, was enough to trigger the endowment effect. And once something is yours, you really hate to give it up. This has real-world implications for people who design communications. Researchers at Boston College found out that people have a high sense of ownership when they actually touch and pinch and zoom while they're doing online shopping. It makes them feel like they're physically interacting with an object. And what happens when the medium isn't digital but it's real? Well, there's been an uptick in paper catalogs recently, up to 9 billion last year after an 8-year downhill slide. Many companies were doing really well online, and so they decreased their paper catalogs, and sales decreased. So is that just a coincidence? Well, it's hard to know. But the New York Times quotes an analyst who points out that a company like Land's End is pretty typical of what happened. Their online sales were doing well, so they decreased the number of catalogs they were sending out, and their sales dropped by $100 million. So they picked up their paper catalog sales again, and they did a survey. And what they found was that 75% of the online purchases started by somebody looking in the paper catalog and making a decision and then going online to buy. So the catalogs were actually driving sales. So how do catalogs drive sales? Well, the research suggests that they are enough to drive ownership imagery, that touching a nicely crafted catalog is sufficient to trigger the endowment effect, that somehow the tactile experience of touching a piece of paper is a surrogate for touching the thing itself. So touch ends up being a really important part of our decision making.
You can imagine how thrilled we were when he taped this. The reason I say that is, up until then, we had all intuited this, but for the first time we actually had scientific validation. The fact that through the endowment effect, we actually, and because we can touch and feel and smell, we have a much closer relationship with that object. We continued doing this research, by the way. We were fascinated by it because what it came down to and what we were trying to prove was the fact that well-crafted advertising, marketing, merchandising in print, in fact, not only created a better relationship and actually showed a lift, but more importantly was the fact that we were struggling with something that was happening in our larger market, and that is that we were seeing print budgets being migrated over to digital departments because that's where the action was, but we needed to prove to them that the actual stimulus was in fact a print-based stimulus. We continued doing the research, and while Dr. Eagleman talks about it in the catalog industry for 75%, when we did an amalgam of all merchandising and all marketing communications, we had numbers as high as 84% of online purchasing were in fact stimulated by magazine advertising, direct mail, and catalog. And particularly, as Linda had said earlier, when we start looking at that cross-semination of different media, you can in fact see dramatic lifts when you had certain combinations. This was incredibly important to us because the outcome was as much that you felt very differently about products and about companies and brands depending on how you saw them. That's what we wanted to get to. And so this was the aha moment. And I continued doing research. This was fascinating for me. And I came upon a book by Dr. Marianne Wolfe. Dr. Marianne Wolfe happens to be the head of neuroscience at Tufts University. She also has an extraordinary CV and a lab. And she she posited, if you will, this concept. And she posited it a long time ago, by the way, and she called it bilateral literacy. She wrote a book called Proust and the Squid. Strange name, I can explain it to you later, but it was in fact tracking this 10-year experiment and research project that she did at Tufts at her lab, and she did the same. She brought in a control of volunteers, and she used fMRI, brain scan, but she also used physiological tracking monitors. And this is what happened. And this was such an aha moment for me that I started really writing about it and talking about it. And she said this: if I give you ink on paper to read, the first thing that happens, your heart rate slows down, your blood pressure goes down, you slow down because you are preparing to read all the words. You're going to read for content and context and nuance. You're going to seek the narrative. And by slowing down and reading the words, you have a much deeper understanding of the content. And this was the key, was you had a higher valuation of the content, you had a higher valuation of the authorship, and the key was you had a higher valuation of the brand. That's what we wanted to prove. We see so much. We are buried by this tsunami of content that it has changed the way that we assimilate data. So what she said then was, and this was the aha moment, if I have you read exactly the same content digitally, and this was so extraordinary. It took Marianne Wolfe and her team over 10 years to prove this. What she proved was, because of the tsunami of content that you know is coming at you, the first thing that happened is, as a society, we have taught ourselves to read faster. More importantly, what she found out neuroscientifically was the fact that we have in fact created a secondary synaptical cortex, a different routing, if you will, for all of the electrical impulses. The minute you open a digital device without you knowing it, in a nanosecond, subliminally, you immediately go to the secondary synaptical cortex. And because you know that the minute you open up that digital device, you've got dozens and dozens of emails and tweets and posts and Instagram and etc., you go into the skim mode. Does that make sense? You have no control over it because you want to move through it as quickly as possible because you know the amount of content that's waiting for you. Even when you're reading a magazine or you're reading an article on your device, you're looking for the keywords. You're skimming. The downside of skimming is you're not reading in depth. You're not reading for deep understanding. You want the data, you want the touch points, and you want to move on. And here's the interesting thing, is the problem is that when we're reading content digitally, we're not getting the full extent of what the content is saying. Some of us are better because we have to read so much online that we take those skills, but it's very rare, quite frankly. That aha moment that we've become a skimming digital reader is important because the key of it is we look for the keywords, we absolutely trust the imagery to help us make the connection. And the key was this, and this was the part that really excited me, was the fact that it had been proven through a search that we look for the link to the video. Key point. What we have to appreciate is because of the way the technology is moving and is being forced into so many of our communication styles, that we have become, if we are transitioning from a word-based marketing model to a visual-based marketing model. That's important, because what it says to us is, if I want to, as a creative director, if I want to fulfill my marketing promise to you, I'm going to give you beautifully written content, but I'm also going to make sure that there's great imagery, and more importantly, if I can, I will absolutely give you a video to support it. You know, the interesting thing is we all have grown up with television. We love video because it's compact, it's easy, and quite frankly, in a new survey that was done, the number one desire of the larger market is convenience. We want convenience, we want ease of use, we want service, then it's price, and sadly, then it's quality. But the point of it is, if I understand the market well, I want to make sure that it's easy, it's convenient, it's quickly accessible, and interestingly enough, video does that. A great speaker had made the comment, the observation, he said, you know, we live in a society now where we would rather watch a 1-minute video explaining to us how something is done rather than having to read the instructions. Does that make sense? Here's the interesting thing. If I go to YouTube and I find a video and I don't necessarily like that version, there's 100 versions right behind it waiting for it, right? More importantly, and this is a necessity now, I can go and type something even very banal. I do this all the time. Banal, and I put it on YouTube, and sure enough, it says you have 250 videos of explanation. Then what I'll do is I'll do the same search, but I'll do it in languages. I can find the same definition or the same explanation in Spanish, in French, in German. There are companies now who do nothing but translate YouTube videos into all the languages, honest to God, right down to like Swahili. Why? Because the interesting thing is now it is an extraordinarily powerful and potent way for us to be able to explain without language being a barrier. We're talking about the importance of communication and how it hits us in our brain. This research was extraordinarily powerful. We're going to see Marianne Wolf in a second again. But what it's come down to is we have a challenge. All of us talk about the fact that we know that there's a shrinking attention span. Right? Does anybody know, by the way, what is the window of attention right now? In seconds. 6 seconds. Yeah, it's 5 seconds right in there, okay? And we know that. I did some research and I wrote a blog recently because I said we have a challenge. And the challenge is that, yes, we do have a shrinking attention span, but what I want you to appreciate is the fact that it is not unique to attention span. What's happening in our culture is, in fact, we have a shrinking window of patience. Does that make sense? The working maxim right now in marketing communication is don't make me work for it, don't make me wait for it. If you're using a link, if that link doesn't work in 5 seconds, I'm gone. If you send me to the wrong part, or if you give me your website rather than the microsite, I'm gone. Type's too small, I'm gone. You're not moving at a fast enough pace, I'm gone. So that we have to appreciate that we have to be able to engage quickly, 5 seconds. I need to be able to retain you. How am I going to be able to retain you? Depending on what I'm doing, I either have to give you education or I have to give you entertainment. Because we've gotten so used to that as a society. So the interesting thing is when I look at that, I realize what's the best way of doing that? Absolutely, in print, we love special effects. We love beautiful print techniques. We love breathtakingly gorgeous photography. It is what captures us. It is what engages us. And we see it being done now to the point where I had the pleasure of being one of the consultants to the United States Post Office and to the Canada Post. And you've seen it. I've been working with them now for about a decade. You're starting to see special effects actually be pulled in now into things like postage stamps, where they're using special effects, stamps that have scent or have thermochromatic ink. How many of you saw the lunar eclipse stamp where it was black, as if it was the height of the lunar eclipse, and you put your thumb on it, and the heat of your finger basically changed it from black to clear, and then you saw the moon again. Special effects engage us. We love them because at the core it is that sensual aspect. We are a sensual species. We love to have our senses stimulated. Whether it's visual or auditory or scent, we love having it done. We even had to learn how to be able to do this now on a digital level because a lot of our runs are very, very small. So the point of this is that, sorry. Oop, sorry. Come on, come back to me. Nope, 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 nope. Nope, 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 nope. Nope. I don't know. I am telling you. And we lost our sound. You can. I'm working here. Come on. I wanted you to see this. This was an insert in a magazine. And the beauty of it is that when your thumbs grab the handles, you saw the little gold pieces, it completes the connection. What happens is this pop-up, first of all, absolutely superb pop-up, but what it does is it takes your heart rate, it shows you your heart rate, and then at the same time, it lights up the LED lights. Was it expensive? God, yeah, of course it was expensive, right? But keep in mind that large corporations, in this case, like Toyota, it's like, concept cars. Are they expensive? Yes. But you're testing out completely new concepts and completely new theories for engagement. And then once we learn how it works, we then figure out how to make it affordable. Does that make sense? And this was a perfect example because it worked so extraordinarily well that they then went on. This is some of the very new printing techniques where we're using electroconductive inks that can carry a charge, and also OLED, optical organic light emitting diodes. All the little lights are done that way. We take that same concept and we look at electroluminescent inks, and we realize I need to engage you. I need to capture your attention. I'm competing against a lot of folks. If I want to sell my brand, I can do it very well. This was done for Bombay Gin. This was done exclusively at the beginning, for the duty-free stores. They realized that they were not doing well in duty-free stores. People were running in. They only had so much time. They had to buy perfume and sunglasses and all this stuff. They needed to capture the attention, so they did this, and that's what it looks like on the shelf. The shopkeeper actually hits the bottom of the package, connects a small 9-volt battery that'll last 90 days, and they put it on the shelf. I don't know about you. If I went into duty-free and I saw that, I'd be grabbing that bad boy up and be like, like that. So anyway, and the last one I want to show you really shows where we are going. I've been following this company now for almost 8 years. Dr. Kate Stone, I saw her on a TED Talk. She was a very nervous engineer getting her PhD. She had literally created the ability to print circuitry on an offset press, modified offset press. What the key was, though, the circuitry she wrote, in fact, was able to connect the piece itself through the phone to Bluetooth. Dream come true. She finishes her first TED Talk. She's very nervous. Your heart goes out to her, literally. I'm not going to show that to you. But a gentleman walks up at the end and says, "That's fascinating what you've done. How much money do you need?" "I want to start a company." The first product that they made under the name Novalia was this.
Think about all the accomplishments. I can see you watching me. Approach everyone positive, but if you can't pick your fam, you're not the man. Think about all the accomplishments. I can see you watching me.
Creating music can really trigger creativity in young people. That's why McDonald's in the Netherlands introduced McDrax, a paper placemat turned into a full music production station.
A paper placemat.
By the use of conductive ink on a piece of paper, we connected our placemat to your smartphone. Every touch point triggered a full sound bank to kickstart your creativity.
I'm going to cut it here because of time. But interestingly enough, last night, Mr. Orr said something that really sort of made me smile. And he was talking about, well, you know, soon we're just going to be able to put our phone down. You know, first of all, we can, near field communication, chips. But the interesting thing is, we now have the ability, in fact, yes, to be able to put our phone down onto a printed product and through the use of the battery and the speaker in your phone, be connected to content. What does that do? It extends, in fact, our relationship. You're going to start seeing things like this right now. Why did they do it in the Netherlands? It's a very small market and it has to be done sheet-fed. But extrapolate this technology now into magazine and into inserts, into covers, into direct mail. You start having a sense of how large the potential is for this. So, quick sidebar, but important. So I'm doing all this research, and I'm talking about the neuroscience and how, you know, important reading ink on paper is, and I come upon this statistic, and it literally stopped what I was doing, and I had to do some additional research based on this. The United States right now ranks 24th in reading globally. 24th. We walk around with all this swagger. We think we are so bad. And the fact is, the statistics show that we are 24th in reading, 25th in science, and 41st in math. Now here's the reality. I'm the CEO of a major corporation, and I'm looking for a second global headquarters. It's not going to be in the United States. Does that make sense? And by the way, it's if you look, it is Asia, yes, but it is the Scandinavian countries. It's Central Europe. I mean, the fact that we rank 24th in reading is an extraordinary concern. I mean, that may not fall on in the hallowed halls of university, but my point is, we've got a problem, and we focus intently while we're in school and in getting our degrees, but once we get outside into the real world, we are no longer generalists. We are forced into being specialists, and as we are becoming specialists, we drop certain skills. So I want to share Marianne Wolf with you again. I think that this is a very telling video.
Literacy is the vehicle for all forms of learning. How can we not give our absolute best knowledge to what will bring the potential out of children everywhere. In this moment in time, we are really on the cusp of a change from what would be called the print-driven brain to the digital reading brain. There are challenges and joyful achievements ahead of us, and there are threats. The child who is distracted is not going to read at the same level of focus and concentration as the child of the past. The average child is changing their attention 27 times an hour. Inside the brain, we have to ensure that that child learns how to focus at the deepest level they can to apply their knowledge to the text. To ensure that process is a very difficult balancing act. So we have as a society to understand what is happening with children who have what's called continuous partial attention. It's not that they can't learn to read very well indeed, but can they learn to read at the level that will give them and us their best concentrated forms of reading? All of us are affected, not only the children. How we read is as important as what we read. And so the future, I believe, from my reckoning of this balancing act that we are all in, every parent is in it as well as every child, is can we learn to provide a foundation for that child so that the formation of what I am calling deep reading is part of the transition and the knowledge that the child takes with them over their development so that they know when to read with depth and concentration and when to read just as you and I do every day, the most surface forms of reading. So that, for me, is the future of a biliterate brain, to know when to do what. But it has to be learned in the beginning for us to be able to switch back and forth. So it's a very important moment in time.
Thomas Friedman, in his last book, Thank You for Being Late, said something that was extraordinarily profound. And he said, it's amazing that in the United States, we are far better at creating distraction than incentives for learning. And I would share with you, if you don't mind, I'll read this, but it says, we are creating and encouraging a culture of distraction where we are increasingly disconnected from the people and the events around us and increasingly unable to engage in long-form thinking. People now feel anxious when their brains are unstimulated. And Linda had mentioned it before. Amazingly enough, it's the very people who are creating these distractions who are now within their own community and with their own children making sure that they're taking the distractions out. And the fact of the matter is we have a challenge, and this, again, this says something extraordinary. We don't know what the larger impact of distraction is going to be over time. You have folks who are fighting for your attention and your distraction at a profit. And they're going to be very good at it, and they're going to hire thousands, tens of thousands of programmers and coders to do just that. And the point of it is, how do we, in fact, get people to go back and read magazines and read books and read what they get? If, you know, I do this presentation for print community, and I beg the larger question, why are we going to continue, in fact, to print things that people cannot read? It's not even that they do not want to read it. In many cases, they cannot read it.
Hey guys, Tara and Trace here for D News, and you know what we don't get enough of anymore? Handwritten letters.
It's true. Handwriting is a dying art. Back in my day, we didn't just have to write our papers, we had to write them in cursive. But thanks to computers, that is now a thing of the past.
I'm going to move forward, but please understand that handwriting and reading have been associated as really uniform skills, and our ability to do both is incredibly important. Interestingly enough, we are now up to 11 states in the United States that have brought cursive back, up from 5. We were as low as 5 states that still taught cursive because the budgets were being cut and they were saying that it's not important. Marianne Wolf has 2 degrees, and one of them is neuroscience, but the other one is she's got a PhD in reading and dyslexia. And one of the reasons that they found the importance of handwriting having the level of importance was in fact discovered in the ability to treat dyslexic readers. The more that they were able to do cursive, the better. So I want to share with you the fact that, in fact, handwriting activates more parts of the brain. Handwriting contributes to reading fluency, and handwriting is a predictor of success in other subjects as well. So all I want to share is we need to, on a corporate level, on a personal level, do everything we can to support all of these amazing organizations that are promoting reading at all ages, and also in a very honest way saying we can live very, very well with print and digital. In fact, our book and our research was called Print And, because the conclusion was print and digital together give us the most optimal advertising, marketing, and merchandising. But we need to be able to make sure that we have it in context. So, conclusion, we need to be able to find a balance in reading and handwriting and start the program and code for all levels. Decrease in reading skills in the United States will drive corporations in foreign countries for employees with much higher skill levels, and parental and educational awareness programs of the psychological hazards of constant distraction. We are reaching a point of monitor fatigue. Neuroscientists are telling us this. We look at monitors so much, whether they're their phones, our tablets, our laptops, and then we go home and what do? We watch television, and the fact is that the brain becomes overstimulated, and when it becomes overstimulated, it shuts down. And at that point, all you are observing, but you are not seeing. You want to be entertained. We have to take our understanding of the endowment effect and bilateral literacy and start to incorporate it in larger conversations with merchandisers and advertisers and marketers. This is why print exists. This is why the strength of print is where it's at and will continue. And we have to understand that we are a sensual species, and to be able to stimulate the senses is extraordinarily important. And finally, we have to be able to use the technology in ink and paper and digital to bring readers back to print. So video is growing incredibly quickly. We have to be able to understand that. How do we incorporate that? Without a doubt, different conversation for a later date. Augmented reality, the reintroduction of QR codes, which we heard about yesterday and will continue to hear about at the conference. The ability to take the reader seamlessly online and bring them back is an incredibly important skill for us to have as designers, as publishers, etc. So print isn't dying by any means. It's just changing. It is going to a higher experience. There's going to be less of it. And the fact is it's either going to be commoditized or it's going to become a luxury item, is what we see in long term. Content will continue to drive, but we're going to see content being changed in a lot of ways in terms of the media itself. And lastly, print has got a great appeal above just age and dollar demographics. Last thing, I want to ask you this, and please, this is not being facetious, but I think it's a very honest question we need to start talking about. Who benefits, who profits from starting a rumor like print is dead? As we were talking about fake news and we're talking about misinformation, rumor is one of the unfortunate tools that is in our arsenal. And the fact is, what we need to understand is that there are people who profit from, in fact, creating that kind of rumor. I'm just going to read this to you very quickly in close. I read voraciously, and I came upon this and it floored me because I was actually working on this whole who benefits, who profits. And it says, it's called Reipel's Law. new, further developed types of media never replace the existing modes of media and their usage patterns. Instead, a convergence takes place in the field, leading to a different way and field of use for these older forms. The old doesn't necessarily die out, and in some instances, the old methods are absorbed or recycled into a new form. In other cases, those methods are refined and distilled down to their essence. And all they're saying is that, in fact, new technology does not kill old technology. That's a very limited way of looking at it. It is that idea that in order to have new technology, it can only happen if you displace old technology and it takes its place. It doesn't happen that way. Why was I so knocked out by this? Amazingly enough, this was written in 1913. Yeah. So I called a historian friend of mine and I said, why does this knock me out? And she said, first and foremost, what you have to understand, innovation and invention is a sine wave. And if you look at it over time, it used to be very slow and not that big, but it was meaningful, and then it got shorter and higher, really meaningful. And now we live in a world where invention and innovation is happening so quickly, it takes our breath away, right? And what it does is it makes us doubt. And she reminded me of something, and I'll leave this with you. Commercially printed books started in the mid-1400s. Newspapers, early 1700s, magazines in the mid-1700s. Interestingly enough, people were worried that magazines might, in fact, replace newspapers. It didn't. It was special interest. When radio came out in the mid-1800s, people really thought that radio was going to displace newspapers and magazines, because why would you read them if someone could read it for you and you could just listen? Didn't happen. In the same way, if you look at live theater, when we started to see moving pictures, everybody thought that movies were going to replace live theater. It didn't. We also thought the same thing about television. Television was going to replace movies. You weren't going to go to the theater anymore. You were just going to stay home. That didn't happen. And lastly, it is, in fact, now where we are being led to believe that that is where streaming is going to take all of the different communication. And the fact is, it doesn't. All it does is it gives us so many more options. And we have to, our responsibility as marketers and merchandisers is to get the right option in front of the right group. And you will have faithful followers with loyalty for a long time. So, I hope that this has been interesting. I hope it's given you some good ideas. You can reach me, email, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. I'm right now at the end of my time. Thank you, Dr. Samir. I'll be around for a while, and I'm happy to answer any questions. So until I see you again, different topic, I hope all your printing meets your expectations. Take care, all.